Hey, so there are a lot more of you here than there were before I released my video on Avatar: The Last Airbender and autism. That video vastly outperformed my other stuff, and I realized that I am really bad at self-promotion and missed a big opportunity to just give myself a shout out. Nothing too major, just, hi, welcome. My name's Raelyn, and we talk about writing here, because I write books. I wrote this book. If it seems up your alley, check it out. But for now, here's a video I made. Enjoy. So, a while back I made a video about watching Thor Ragnarok for my first time, and how, while I understood why a lot of people enjoyed the film, I didn't feel it was an appropriate conclusion to the trilogy. So, I did what any sane person would do, and I rewrote the entire screenplay. Which is a totally normal thing to do. So, let's talk about it. But before that, the obligatory disclaimers. First, if you haven't seen my Thor Ragnarok critique video, you might want to watch that, because I don't want to re-explain issues that I've already outlined there. Second, this rewrite is purely for educational purposes, and I am springboarding off other writers' work. I cannot take credit for the ideas or work of Marvel, Taika Waititi, any additions to the script the cast may have contributed, nor especially for the work of the writers of the film, Eric Pearson, Craig Kyle, and Christopher Yost. Third, I usually write novels, so if you're an aspiring screenwriter, please do not use my rewrite as a model for proper formatting. Lastly, my rewrite is a first draft, and my first drafts tend to be too long. So if you find that some scenes drag, you're probably not imagining it. There's still lots of room for improvement and for tightening things up, but this should still work for the purposes of this video. With those disclaimers out of the way, let's look at my overarching goals for this rewrite. My first goal is to bring Ragnarok back to its melodramatic roots. There will still be humor, but I'll be shifting the balance toward a Shakespearean family drama. Now, we don't have time to discuss every tiny change I made, so even if I say a scene from the film was fine, understand that I probably still made lots of dialogue and tone changes to it. I'm making hefty rewrites to the plot, but I am sticking within earshot of the original. My changes can't conflict with later films, with one exception I'm allowing myself. More on that later. I mentioned in my other video that the film splits its focus between two themes, but a shift in perspective can actually allow both the concept of colonialism and Asgard is not a place, it's a people to uplift the same theme. So our theme will instead be about strength, not home. We're told in the film that both Hela's and Thor's strength comes from Asgard, so both of them will start out our film believing their power comes from Asgard the place and any conquered lands or relics associated with it, like the throne or Mjolnir. Hela's ideological belief is that strength comes from control, and she attempts to increase her power through colonialist war. Thor will start off over-reliant on Mjolnir, but will eventually realize his true power lies in friendship, brotherhood, and community. Thus, these seemingly two separate themes uplift one message. Since character arcs should ideally be explorations of the theme, I want our characters to start off viewing strength as some form of control. Those who learn to prioritize connection will be better for it, and those who cling to control will see their downfall as a result. Let's look at our relationship character. All of the Thor films have depicted a tyrannical side to Odin, who gained power through controlling realms, relics, and people. So, rather than him going gently into that good night, Odin's death should be a consequence of a life lived seeking control. Now, for our villains. I envision Hela as someone who, like Loki, took to brutality not necessarily because she was naturally inclined to it, but because she thought following in Odin's footsteps was how to bond with him. Ultimately, Odin's love was conditional and, in a way, his own form of control. In Hela's mind, recreating Asgard at the height of its bloody past under her name will be a way of usurping Odin's control over her. But every good arc needs the character to have a flaw that makes it hard for them to learn their lesson, so Hela's flaw is her inability to let go of that past, which continues to grant Odin power over her. The Grandmaster is another example of how control is an inferior form of strength. Where Hela attempts to control things, the Grandmaster controls people, but while he creates the illusion of connection, it's self-motivated, and his followers are equally insincere toward him in their affection. Now for our hero. Thor's belief that true power comes from the possession of Asgardian things like the throne and Mjolnir results in his over-reliance on Mjolnir and Odin, the man on the throne, and a man who represents the upper limits of strength one can obtain through control. In the film, we're told Thor's flaw is that, even when he had 2 eyes, he'd still only see half the picture. Now, I want to explore this through his relationship with Loki and through deconstructing Thor's idealization of his father. Since a good villain helps the hero learn their lesson, Hela should be the eye-opener Thor needs to take Odin off that pedestal. So Thor goes from believing his power comes from Asgard the place, the seat of his father's empire, to relinquishing control of Asgard and realizing his true power comes from people Odin was willing to sacrifice to maintain that empire. Even people like Loki. Loki has always wanted exactly what he's supposed to want, connection, but he struggles with trust and mistakes vapid adoration as a valid replacement for love, which is what his major flaw is in our film. Loki starts his arc desperate to maintain control of the throne, which to him has become a symbol of the love Daddy offered Thor but withheld from him, and is also Loki's way of reclaiming power that was stripped from him. But by the end, he's willing to sacrifice that throne for the sake of his connection with Thor and Asgard. As for how Hela impacts Loki's arc, she and Thor set 2 paths before him. Loki will eventually realize that Hela's path won't give him what he wants, but he isn't ready to fully choose Thor's path either. What Ragnarok got right was allowing Loki to forge his own path down the middle. Next, we have Valkyrie, who's the character I'm changing the most from the film. I found it infuriating how the film tried to present her as being just the coolest. When, oh yeah, she's also a slaver who profits from selling living beings for the sole purpose of them being brutally murdered for other people's sport, also that she can afford her alcohol addiction. And the film just never has her unpack that. In our version, I imagine Valkyrie has given into hopelessness after her devastating loss to Hela. But when she ends up on Sakaar, unable to get away, there's still a part of her that sees the suffering and is unable to do nothing. So our Valkyrie is going to be the trainer for the gladiators, which allows her some facsimile of control. She wants to give them as much chance at surviving as she can, but she doesn't want to connect with them only to watch them die, so she's standoffish. Given the result of her last attempt to overthrow an evil tyrant, she shows no support for the gladiators' desire for a rebellion, but by the end, she steps into a leadership role again to lead the gladiators' rebellion and join Thor's fight against Hela. Lastly, Bruce Banner's arc was already about fighting for control before becoming Hulk to protect his friends, but we are going to show him being more concerned about what harm he might have caused as the Hulk. Alright, now it's time for the Ragnarok rewrite. To save time, I'll pop excerpts of my rewrite up on the screen as I discuss them. Pause the video if you want more time to read through them. But with that introduction finally out of the way, let's get this party started. So the first scene in Waititi's film has Thor narrating how he arrived on Muspelheim and defeating Surtur to prevent Ragnarok. Viewers do need to know Thor won the fight, but I'm going to imply Thor fought Surtur and won while cutting the actual fight scene. Not because it's a bad scene, but because I'm inserting a new scene after this that's more important for the viewer to pay attention to, and I don't want to overload viewers up front with too much spectacle. For the next scene, I inserted a prologue for 3 reasons. First, in the film, Thor tells us he's had dreams of Ragnarok, but this is a visual medium. It's better to let viewers witness these dreams ourselves. Allowing viewers to see the dreams also raises the stakes, showing us exactly what awaits Asgard if Thor fails. Second, all the previous Thor films began with a prologue in which Odin tells us of a legendary battle. If Ragnarok is to be a true installment in the trilogy, it needs the same format. And the third reason I included this prologue is I simply wanted to hint at Hela early. In the junior novelization of the film, Hela is introduced as this nebulous, sentient darkness, and she doesn't take the form of a woman until she reaches Asgard. I thought those shadow powers had potential, so I'm stealing them. Next, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, I didn't want Thor to be able to use the Bifrost at all. So when his calls to Heimdall go unanswered, he travels to Svartalfheim, where, thanks to his life-changing field trip with Loki in the Dark World, Thor is now aware of a secret passage into Asgard that can shorten his trip home. So Thor awakens from his dream on Svartalfheim. Since he had to stop here anyway, he visits a memorial that he probably placed himself where he believes Loki died. We're told in the film that Thor mourned for Loki, but we mostly only ever get evidence of him detesting his brother, so let's show him actually loving and caring and mourning for Loki. I wanted Thor to find a dagger that I decided Loki must have lost here during the Dark World. Thor takes the dagger in memory of Loki. Again, to show us that Thor cares about Loki, but also to show Loki that Thor cares about Loki. When Loki is shown this dagger, he won't remember where he lost it, but once he does remember, he'll realize that Thor visited his grave, which makes things kind of click for Loki that someone in his life does genuinely care. Just to end off the scene, we have a brief cut to the observatory where we see that Thor's calls for the Bifrost are deliberately being ignored by Scourge. So, like most people, I enjoyed Loki's introduction in the Waititi film, where he watches a play glorifying himself. But from a writing standpoint, this scene actually has several problems. Loki incorrectly assumes a throne will give him the love he wants and needs. Key word being incorrectly. It's not actually supposed to give him love and affection, so it's important to show him deeply unfulfilled by the throne. And while I believe Loki would attempt to shift public opinion of him, and that some Asgardians would indulge him to gain their king's favor, I don't buy such a swift change in 1,000-year-old biases, and thought it was important to show Loki struggling to get the people to view him the way he wants. Finally, Ragnarok tells us Loki has abandoned the other realms, and the film plays it off as incompetence.
All while you, Odin, the protector of those 9 realms, is sitting here in your bathrobe eating grapes.
Yes, well, it is best to respect our neighbour's freedom.
But we know it isn't incompetence that makes him a poor leader so much as emotional instability and poor priorities. It's truer to character and fits our themes better if Loki pulls out of the other realms to maintain tight control of his borders. Having had and lost a throne before, and ironically the more unfulfilled he feels by the throne, the more Loki tightens his hold on it. Our Loki wants Asgardian soldiers in Asgard, fiercely defending every border, especially from Thor. Sadly, in his quest for love and connection, Loki is isolating himself. Before we move on, I just wanted to point out quickly that Loki is drinking Vanir wine and eating green grapes, because that's going to come up later. But for now, let's get back to Thor. In Ragnarok, Thor arrives on Asgard, meets Scourge, and finds out Heimdall has been labeled a traitor. But in our version, he instead arrives at the portal to Asgard and finds it guarded by soldiers who've been ordered to keep him out. They end up having a disagreement.
We ended up disagreeing.
We then return to Loki again to find Hogun warning him of unrest in the realms, but Loki is more concerned with keeping Thor out. Too bad for him, though, because soon Thor bursts into the room after having won his fight against those guards. Thor notices the Vanir wine and green grapes, and it immediately tips him off to Loki's disguise, as I imagine that these are favorites of Loki's, not Odin's. But, like in the film, he plays along for a moment to taunt Loki. Thor gives Loki the dagger he found, which is where we set up Loki not remembering where he'd lost it. Then, Thor gives away that he knows Loki is disguising himself and demands Loki take them to their father. The scene of Thor and Loki outside the care home is okay, but I did want to show part of the scene that I did make changes to. First, this is maybe a nitpicky thing, but I have Loki mention the Norn instead of witches, purely to show that these guys have their own world, history, and cultural references. Characters in the details, so let's show those details. But I wanted to discuss this joke that I critiqued in my other video and show how you can use humor more carefully to not only be in character, but to help set up other aspects of the story. If Loki is offended by Thor's joke, it's not the joke. It's the fact that Thor thinks so little of Loki, he thinks Loki would be offended by the joke. This is a subtle but important distinction. When Loki is offended, he hides it, and he responds in a way that's meant to elevate himself over others, in our case, by making himself look smarter than Thor. So Loki rolls his eyes and suggests Thor has little going on upstairs, but he does so in a very specific way, by bringing up Mjolnir. Now, I'm not going to pretend that my version of the joke is significantly funnier than what we got in the film. I'm not really a comedy writer. but an actual comedy writer should be able to make this at least as funny. But what this joke does that the other one didn't is it allows our characters to stay in character. It reveals Loki is still jealous of Thor's favor with their father, that Thor was the one given Mjolnir. Thor's reaction reveals his insecurity about his ability and worthiness without Mjolnir, which helps set up the plot arc where he loses Mjolnir. This joke also transitions better into Thor being upset Loki allowed him to believe he was dead. And the way Thor talks about relying on his hammer more than Loki also ties into his character arc about learning to value the superior strength he receives from the people around him. Right now, he puts too much trust in Mjolnir. The joke itself might not be funnier, but it's a much better use of the joke. So most of the scene where Thor meets with Doctor Strange is fine. However, I don't buy for 1 second that the Odin we were introduced to in prior films would have chosen to remain in exile, as Ragnarok suggests. Odin's not going to let Loki rule unchallenged, especially not if Hela's trying to break free and Loki is all Asgard has to defend her. Instead, I highly suspect that whenever Doctor Strange met Odin, Odin would not have been particularly forthcoming. And beyond that, Doctor Strange will suggest that he couldn't really get a hold of Thor anyway, something Ragnarok already implied and is a much better explanation for him not telling Thor where Odin was. Later, in the Waititi film, when Loki returns to the scene,
I have been falling for 30 minutes!
He is stupidly looking for a fight.
You think you're some kind of sorcerer? Don't think for 1 minute you second-rate.
All right, bye-bye.
But while the Loki we know certainly can be direct when need be, it's Thor who's supposed to be the impulsive brute, while Loki is the meticulous schemer.
Thor, stop and think. Look around you, we're outnumbered.
Know your place, brother.
So our Loki tests the waters with Doctor Strange, for sure, and he is offended by him, which causes him to be condescending. But he doesn't immediately draw his daggers. Otherwise, let's go and see what Odin's up to. Odin's death scene was another from the film that seems nice on the surface, but it ended up being one of the scenes that I had the most gripes with. But before we get into those gripes, let's discuss why, if Odin hasn't chosen to remain in exile, he's hanging out twiddling his thumbs in Norway. We've known for several films that Odin is weakening, so if some of Odin's strength also comes from Asgard, then by sending Odin away after he usurped the throne, I think Loki unwittingly weakened Odin more and made him vulnerable to Hela's escape attempts. In our version, Odin very much was trying to get back to Asgard, but when Heimdall didn't answer his calls, Odin planned to use dark magic to return, something he needed more strength to do. If Asgard gives him strength, then he went to the closest place Earth had to Asgard, the place where he battled the frost giants so long ago. But Odin still wasn't strong enough to return home. His attempts to use dark magic and his battle with Hela have taken a severe toll. He's haggard, but still desperate to maintain control. Alright, so now let's talk about my gripes with the original scene. First of all, I just did not buy Odin's meekness. Odin does have the capacity for wisdom and sometimes for forgiveness, but we've also seen that he's a very proud, headstrong, and frankly cruel man. Now, before I explain my next point, I want to be very clear that I'm not an expert and I'm not comfortable diagnosing what has become an overused buzzword. I don't want to claim that this is an accurate reflection of the condition. I can't say that. However, I have found myself wondering if there might be a narcissist in the Asgardian royal family. And no, I'm not referring to Loki. Odin and his family do seem to fall tidily into a common dynamic for families that have a narcissistic parent. So again, not diagnosing, but regardless of whether Odin would qualify for an NDP diagnosis, I thought it still made sense to research how a narcissist would face their own death. What I found is narcissists often get worse when facing their death. Their deaths are often emotionally messy and deeply painful for themselves and everyone around them, which fit my instincts for the scene. I didn't think Odin would be so meek, particularly not to Loki, and I also didn't think that this scene should be sweet or provide closure. These three haven't earned an amicable parting, so this should be as dramatic, hurtful, and messy as the rest of their relationship has been. I know fans love how Loki finally hears Odin loves him, but I don't feel it's honest to either character. Loki yearns to hear those words, but once he got them, I don't think he'd feel touched. I think he'd be pissed. When you consider how hard Loki tried to get Odin to say those words, when you consider all the torment he could have been spared if only Odin had uttered them sincerely once in Loki's millennium of life, to hear Odin say them now so easily, moments before he dies and won't have to prove he means them, this isn't heartwarming. This is cruel and manipulative. And I want the death scene to reflect that. So, though I didn't go as extreme as I could have, our Odin is angrier and he lashes out with blame. Odin explains about Hela, but Loki especially receives the news bitterly. He's uncomfortable around his father and just wants to leave. Okay, Hela is going to appear soon, so let's discuss my plans for her. We're told that she grows stronger the longer she's on Asgard, and the film does depict this visually a little, but I wanted to make that visual change more pronounced. Our Hela starts off with a slightly incorporeal form. She's ragged, and she's only capable of conjuring knives at first, not full swords. That comes later. Second, it's important to emphasize how Thor and Loki aren't getting along. If they need to come together to save the day in the end, then right now everything falls apart precisely because they can't get along. So their arguing exhausts Odin, weakening him, and allowing Hela an opportunity to break free from her prison before Odin's death. If you're not aware, there was another version of Odin's death filmed in which Hela killed him herself. Waititi changed this to the scene we got because test audiences found the original sad. But sad is exactly what we need. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to make Odin's death a direct result of his need to control others. And I also want to make Hela's conflict with the brothers much more personal. Hela getting revenge by killing Odin for imprisoning her accomplishes both of those things. So in our rewrite, when Loki gets up to leave, Thor gets into a heated argument with him. Their argument drains Odin, which allows for Hela to cut her way out of her prison and attack. Afterward, Hela faces the brothers, and I wanted to show Thor's over-reliance on Mjolnir, charging right in at her instead of listening to Loki's counsel. I also wanted to make it clear right from the get-go that Thor is struggling to make lightning after Mjolnir is destroyed. I want to make that connection very clear. And yet again, I wanted to show how the brothers are not working as a team. Loki backs away and calls for the Bifrost discreetly, because in our version he plans to use it just for himself. Now, Ragnarok Loki isn't under the influence of the Mind Stone, so I don't think he necessarily wants to see Thor dead here, nor does it suit his interests to let Hela roam free, but I do think he'd use Thor to hold off Hela while he runs off to fetch a small army. But Loki does not communicate his plans and seems purely self-interested as he jumps into the Bifrost. And then the Bifrost scene plays out much like in the film. But then Hela arrives in Asgard, and now we come to the only change I'm allowing myself that will alter future films, albeit only mildly. In the next few scenes with Hela, Waititi had her swiftly dispose of the Warriors 3. I cannot express enough how I disagree with this choice to kill them off senselessly. If you must get rid of them, at the bare minimum use their deaths to deepen Thor's emotional conflict with Hela. But I'm actually not going to kill them off. Instead, Hela injures Fandral here. Seeing no other option, Volstagg grabs Fandral and leaps into the Bifrost. Hela shuts down the Bifrost before they would have been able to make it to Earth, which means that we have no idea if they survived. Hela then approaches Scourge, and the scene ends as it did in the film. Then Thor arrives on Sakaar, but since Valkyrie is no longer a bounty hunter, it's Topaz who comes to collect him. She's accompanied by several helmeted guards, and there is one guard who will stand out slightly from the others. Remember him. He's gonna come up later. Next, we have the scene where Hela confronts Hogun and some soldiers on her way to the palace. In our version, Hogun escapes alive. Afterward, we see the scene of Heimdall stealing the Bifrost sword from the observatory. We cut to Thor waking up, restrained to a chair as he's introduced to Sakaar. In the film, the voiceover emphasizes that Sakaar is Thor's new home, which fit the old theme, but it doesn't fit ours. So I rewrote this to feel more authoritarian, to contrast how goofy the Grandmaster seems, but especially to show how the Grandmaster, like Loki, keeps tight control of his borders to safeguard his power. But then Thor meets the Grandmaster, and we let Jeff Goldblum do his thing. I want to make Thor's trouble with his lightning visually clearer, so in our version, he can't make lightning bolts at all, not even tiny ones. He literally can just make sparks fly. I've also given the Grandmaster a device he refers to as his universal remote. It's not really a remote, but is basically a small personal computer that controls almost everything. This is going to be important later, so we show him using it now. From here, this scene plays out roughly as expected, except that Loki isn't in this scene because we're introducing him differently. I also wanted to show the Grandmaster has been dealing with dissent, so we emphasize that his cousin led an attempted coup. After dealing with Carlo, the Grandmaster tells Thor of the contest of champions. Thor agrees to fight his champion, and he gets sent away to the gladiator prison. In Ragnarok, this is where Thor meets Korg. Now, I do have Korg in my rewrite because I needed a contestant who was eager to start a revolution, but I've reduced his character a bit to make more space for the Warriors 3, because our Thor meets Volstagg and Fandral here. The Bifrost yeeted them to Sakaar too. This is what I mean about using the Warriors 3 to increase Hela's impact on Thor. By learning Hela injured his friend, it increases Thor's personal conflict with her. It also shows him what she might be doing to the rest of Asgard in his absence, which also increases his personal conflict with her. As Fandral's injury worsens, it applies pressure to Thor and increases tension. Much better than just killing the Warriors 3 off willy-nilly. After greeting each other, the trio go to the room where the contestants practice for their matches, and Thor informs his friends of Odin's death. We then learn Fandral and Volstagg have heard rumors that it was Hela who wiped out the Valkyrie. Remember that guard I pointed out who helped Topaz bring in Thor? Well, Thor notices him hanging around, watching them from a distance. Then we introduce Valkyrie, who arrives to train the contestants, and Thor spars with her. Thor gets off to a rough start with Valkyrie, and he fails to convince her to help him. So the next scene in the film is fine. Hela takes Scourge to the vault and uses the Eternal Flame to reawaken Fenris and her undead army. Then we get back to see what Thor's up to. This next scene is heavily reworked, but is my version of Thor's funeral for Odin. At the end of the day, guards lock the contestants into cramped cells for the night. Thor learns Fandral is more hurt than he's letting on. Then, while the others sleep, Thor takes a hammer he brought from the practice room and holds a little funeral for Odin. Then that guard, who's been watching him, appears, and we find out that the guard is, in fact, Loki. During this rewrite, I thought about how to give the brothers more screen time together and decided that Loki needed to have more freedom of movement to make that work. While I do believe that Loki might climb the social ladder and try to supplant the Grandmaster, I figured that the more well-known he was, the more demand there'd be for his time and attention, and the less he'd be able to skulk about and have scenes with Thor. So in our version, Loki does have designs on the Grandmaster's position, but for now he's still an unknown figure, observing his targets while he schemes. So this reunion in my screenplay is one of those spots that does drag and loses some of its emotional punch. I would heavily streamline this in a second draft, but you should get the idea of what I was going for. Thor is excited to see Loki alive. Loki asks Thor about his dagger, but doesn't get an answer. The brothers decide they should work together and escape, but soon realize they have very different end goals for that. They argue, and Thor blames Loki for allowing Hela to break free. Blaming Loki for Hela made no sense in the Waititi film, because as far as we ever knew, he didn't cause Odin's death. But in our version, Loki does share some responsibility for her escape. As much as he doesn't want to admit it, he's not comfortable with that fact. I also included a line where Thor tells Loki he's disappointed in him. As far as Loki's part in the Thor films goes, each film has been about him trying to make a different family member proud. First it's his father.
Make your father proud.
I could have done it! For you!
Second, his dead mother.
Hello, Mother. Have I made you proud? Trust my rage. I didn't do it for him.
For Ragnarok, it's going to be Thor. But for these boys to reconcile, Loki needs to be honest with Thor, which is difficult for him, but possible when you push the right buttons. So Thor does. Loki reminds him he's been traumatized by their father. Thor tries to brush it off, but Loki leaves angry. So the next scene is the next evening, where Thor prepares for his match. In the film, he tells Korg about Mjolnir, tries to recruit Valkyrie, and gets his haircut. We do the same, except for rather than talk to Korg, Thor speaks to Fandral, so he's reminded of what's at stake if he doesn't win their freedom. Next is the big match. Now on the surface, our version and Waititi's are pretty close, but there are some key differences. The biggest change I made involves Loki. We follow Loki on his way to the Grandmaster's private balcony. He passes by a room that has the door slightly ajar, and he sees the Grandmaster recording himself with his universal remote as he gives his big introductory speech to the contestants. This is to establish that the Grandmaster's remote can control the drones and create the giant holograms we see of him. This ability will come up later. But then Loki goes to the Grandmaster's private balcony, dons a colorful, ostentatious outfit to fit in, and walks in like he's supposed to be there. When the Grandmaster arrives after giving his speech, he simply assumes Loki is a, special gift from Topaz. Loki plays into the Grandmaster's assumptions, and we see that side of him that might have led to this Loki. The important part of this scene, however, is this. In Waititi's film, we're told Loki acquired the Grandmaster security codes.
The Grandmaster has a great many ships. I may even have stolen the access codes to his security system.
But that's really another thing that we should be allowed to see. So Loki steals the Grandmaster's remote, and now he holds all the leverage he needs to strike a deal with Thor. The other big change I'm making is one I stole from the novelization. In the film, Thor and Hulk are brutally at odds for the entire match, but in the novelization, Thor survives because Hulk eventually recognizes him and saves his life. I thought this was an important addition for a story about the power of friendship. So next scene in the film is where Hela learns there's a resistance unhappy with her rule and that someone has stolen the Bifrost sword. Afterward, we then see shots of Asgardian refugees fleeing from Hela's minions. Heimdall comes to the rescue, and he leads them to the hidden fortress in the mountains. I set this scene at night. So many of the scenes on Asgard happen during the cheerful hours of the day where things are bright and colorful, which negatively impacts the gravity of those scenes. Asgard is going through a rough time right now under Hela, and we want everything to feel dark and oppressive. Second, Ragnarok gives us rare glimpses that the Asgardians are a warrior culture, but for the most part, Waititi forgets that and depicts them as rich fops. Now, I don't expect every Asgardian to be a soldier, but I want to make sure that we're depicting a culture that prizes the spirit of a warrior. These refugees aren't trained soldiers, but they're still instilled with that warrior spirit. Finally, I have also added Hogun to the scene. He's helping refugees escape the city. But then we're back to Sakaar as Thor wakes in Hulk's quarters. He learns of the Quinjet and that he can't leave the room with his obedience disc. I altered some dialogue so that Thor comes across as less manipulative. But then we move on to the next scene, which is one of my own. In the wee hours of the morning, the Grandmaster and his guards and admirers finish off a very long night of partying. The Grandmaster realizes his remote is gone and leads his entourage back to look for it. Loki creates a projection of himself to follow along with them, while he makes his exit and checks out the Grandmaster's device. We don't know what he's found yet, but we do get the impression that it's very useful. I put this scene in because I wanted a scene of Loki slipping away and realizing how valuable what he'd stolen was. But it was also nice to set up a bit of a rivalry between Loki and Topaz for something that happens later. I have also seen some Loki fans complain that this film didn't show him using magic as much as they thought it should, so we get a little bit of that here too. But most importantly, I really wanted a scene where Loki sees that none of the Grandmaster's admirers' affection is sincere, that lording power over others won't get Loki the real love he wants. Next, we have another of my scenes. Loki impersonates a guard again and seeks Thor in the practice area, unaware Thor isn't there. To contrast Loki realizing how insincere the Grandmaster's admirers are, now he gets to witness the sincere admiration the gladiators have for Thor, which annoys Loki to no end. Korg, learning Volstagg and Fandral know the Lord of Thunder personally, asks excited questions about Thor. A crowd gathers. Korg asks Volstagg if Thor would lead their revolution. This irritates Valkyrie, who finds the gladiators' admiration for Thor dangerous. She leaves in a huff, and Loki secretly follows her. Valkyrie then arrives in the Hulk's quarters and takes Hulk away to train. Thor then contacts Heimdall. For those irritated that Thor, Love, and Thunder allowed Thor to share his powers with others and felt that created giant plot holes, I have news for you. Ragnarok already set that precedent, because in Waititi's film, Thor asks Heimdall to lend him his eyesight so that they can converse as though in person. But in our version, Thor's conversation is going to be one-sided. Heimdall hears Thor tell him that he's trying to find a way home and that Fandral will need healers waiting for him. But Thor can't hear Heimdall, which means that he can't learn which wormhole to take home. He will have to rely even more on a certain someone with access to the Grandmaster's little computer. Next, the film jumps forward to Thor's and Hulk's argument. This scene really needed to happen between Thor and Loki, so in ours, after Thor's one-sided conversation with Heimdall, he realizes he's no longer alone. Having tailed Valkyrie, a projection of Loki lounges nearby. Once more, Loki asks Thor where he found his dagger and gets no answer. Loki offers Thor a deal that Thor really doesn't want to take, and promises to help save Asgard, but only if Thor will promise to afterward leave Asgard for good and let Loki have the throne. They argue, push each other's buttons, share some harsh truths, and Loki leaves, stating that his offer is still on the table, but that Thor's going to want to make a decision soon. The next scene in the film happens the next day, when Valkyrie comes again to take Hulk for more training, but we'll just have this play out when they both return from training. Thor confronts Valkyrie, removes his obedience disc, and crashes through the window to run for the Quinjet. In the film, this is where Thor tells Valkyrie that Odin is dead and Hela has returned. In our version, Thor, who is forced to realize Odin unjustly covered up the truth, asks Valkyrie to tell him what happened when she fought Hela. And this is where we want to see the visuals of Valkyrie's memory. In the film, those visuals are shown when she fights Loki, but for us, it happens now. The memory leaves Valkyrie shaken, and she's even more shaken when Thor tells her that Hela has returned. But Valkyrie still isn't ready to agree to help him, and she gives in to hopelessness. But Thor still steals the fob, he removes his obedience disc, and he jumps out the window. So Thor finds the Quinjet, the Hulk follows him, destroys the Quinjet, and turns back into Banner. The Grandmaster then alerts the people of Sakaar to Thor's and Hulk's escape. The only changes I'm going to make are, instead of having Thor and Hulk have a proverbial eggplant measuring contest as they argue over who won their match, I'm instead going to do what the novelization did and show Banner concerned that he might have hurt Thor. I'm also making a change to the Grandmaster's announcement. In the absence of his universal remote, he's been forced to use an inferior backup. By now, the Grandmaster has realized Loki stole his remote, so now Thor, Hulk, and Loki are all targets of the manhunt. We are now going to completely cut the next scenes where the Grandmaster fosters competition between Loki and Valkyrie, where Loki confronts Valkyrie, and where Valkyrie captures Loki. Gone. All of it. Instead, in a daze, Valkyrie returns to the practice area to find the gladiators heard the Grandmaster's announcement and want to start a revolution, to get their revenge, and to draw the Grandmaster's eye away from Thor. This is what causes Valkyrie to change her mind and help. Her charges are going to throw themselves into danger for Thor's sake, and they're doing it without a leader. They need her. Valkyrie, realizing she can't change their minds, decides to step up and lead them, but for now, she asks them to hang tight while she finds Thor to work out a real plan. Next, Banner and Thor take a break in the street. Banner informs Thor he's struggling to control the Hulk. Thor informs Banner of Hela. We're gonna cut the part where Thor tries to manipulate Banner into turning the Hulk.
It's gross.
What? No,
You don't care about me. You're not my friend.
No, I don't even like the Hulk. He's all
Really?
like, smash, smash. I prefer you.
Because our Thor regrets, but accepts his friend's decision. Thor and Banner then meet Valkyrie, who leads them to her quarters and agrees to help fight Hela. Tiny side note that there's a man from the parade wearing a hideous Hulk mask standing just down the hallway from them. Since Valkyrie hasn't captured Loki in our version, they simply enter her quarters and work on an escape plan. They realize they need a ship and try to decide which wormhole to escape through. Valkyrie points out the one that brought her to Sakaar, but says it'll take them 18 months to get to Asgard that way. Then, that person in the hallway wearing the ugly Hulk mask appears in the doorway and says it sounds like they need a guide. Surprise! The man was Loki in disguise.
Surprise!
Loki explains that he has all the information he needs to get them to Asgard within hours. As a show of good faith, he tells them which wormhole to use. They realize the only ships that can survive the trip are in the Grandmaster's personal hangar, which requires Loki's security codes. Thor, Banner, and Valkyrie then discuss whether they should ally with Loki. In Waititi's film, this is where Thor tells the story of how Loki turned into a snake and stabbed him as a child. If you watched my critique video, you know why I hate this story. But if you've watched my videos on my favorite Thor scenes, if I get those up before this one, then you'll also know that I love the idea of Thor telling a story, because it pairs nicely with the get help scene and shows us that Thor doesn't realize he's guilty of very similar behavior and contributes to the bad blood between him and Loki.
Even when you had two eyes, you'd see only half the picture.
So I made my own childhood story of Loki. This is another place where a funnier writer than me could make some improvements, but the idea is that when Thor and Loki were kids, Odin had Thor make a speech to the soldiers at a big banquet. It was probably the first time Thor had been given such an honor and responsibility. He was already nervous, but then Loki turned him into a frog mid-speech. This ties in nicely to the jokes the MCU makes about Loki turning Thor into a frog. It reveals Loki's jealousy and the sort of mean-spirited pranks that hint at a darker side, while still being in character with the Loki we'd been introduced to in earlier films. Unlike the snake story, this is something he might have actually done. But someone paying close attention will realize Loki may have had reason to feel jealous. He wasn't offered the same honor of giving a speech. Afterward, seeing no other option, Thor conditionally agrees to Loki's terms. If Loki helps them save Asgard, Loki gets the throne. Valkyrie then informs them they'll need a distraction, and she knows just who can help. Now we're heading into the final quarter of the film, where the bulk of the action is. We're going to be jumping around rapid fire between several characters, which could get confusing, so I've made this flowchart to help us kind of keep track of everyone. In our version of the scene where Valkyrie deactivates the Gladiator's obedience disc, she brings Banner with her. She will lead the revolution, but Banner will guide Volstagg and Fandral, who's too injured to fight, to a rendezvous point near the wormhole. Loki, off with Thor, uses the universal remote to deactivate the obedience discs and unlock doors to that section of the palace so that the gladiators can move freely on their hunt for the Grandmaster. The revolution has begun. In the film, the scene where the Grandmaster finds out about the revolution isn't essential and could have just been cut. But I wanted to use it to show how the Grandmaster manipulates people and why Topaz is so eager to capture our heroes. So the Grandmaster, unhappy at being inconvenienced, manipulates Topaz into working harder, telling her he'd been planning to give her a big promotion. But given how she's been handling this manhunt and revolution, he's not sure she's ready. She promises to prove herself and capture the fugitives, and the Grandmaster heads off with his entourage to lock himself in his bunker. Next, we cut to Thor and Loki as Loki uses his remote to hack into the security system and unlock more doors. In the film, this scene and the next few ones are supposed to show the brothers not getting along, yet they're still able to fight through the guards like a team. I wanted to make it clear that when they're not on the same page as brothers, they don't fight well as a team either. I am moving up the get help scene to here, because I want Loki to point out how Thor browbeats him. For our brothers to reconcile, both of them should recognize their part in this strained relationship between them. Loki shouldn't have to submit wholly to Thor's will. Thor should grow too. In our version, Thor hears guards on the other side of the door and bullies Loki into doing get help. They fight through the guards and Thor has fun with their childhood game, but as Loki picks himself off the floor afterward, he tells Thor he's never enjoyed get help, he finds it humiliating, and he only indulged Thor because he felt he couldn't say no. Thor must now contend with the possibility that he shares responsibility for his falling out with Loki. But Loki is already unlocking the next door blocking their path, and soon they're on to fighting their way through more guards. Now we get to see Thor and Loki's lack of cohesion in their relationship and how it impacts their teamwork. They fight the guards in the next corridor, but they're not in sync. Thor can only make his electrical sparks, and Loki's not at his most graceful either. The brothers barely win their fight. We then get the elevator scene. In the film, Loki plans to betray Thor here. Something I picked up on the moment he said he should stay on Sakaar. 2 minutes ago, he said he was no longer safe there. Thor must have picked up on that discrepancy too, because he's ready for Loki's betrayal and taunts and tortures him once they get to the hangar. This is played in the film as the reason Loki decides to become a hero, but in my critique, I pointed out why this is bad and would likely solidify Loki's villainy. Which is probably why the novelization never had Loki betray Thor. I think the brothers genuinely need to work through their differences here so that later we can test their reforged bond and see if it's true. So, just like in the Waititi film, in our version, Thor builds Loki up here.
Loki, I thought the world of you. I thought we were going to fight side by side forever,
But unlike in the film, he doesn't write him off.
At the end of the day, you're you and I'm me. And I don't know, maybe they're still good in you, but let's be honest, our paths diverged a long time ago.
And we're going to go even deeper with the whole building up thing. We're going to place Thor's speech about how Loki can be more than the god of mischief here, turning it into a genuinely sweet moment instead of a self-righteous lecture. And just like in the novelization, Loki comes as close to admitting as he's capable that he feels responsible for Hela. Thor says it's time for both of them to choose to do better. Heartwarming, right? Then, as they prepare to fight the guards in the hangar, Thor, in anticipation of the fight, is starting to make little bitty lightning bolts rather than just sparks. Now that he's working through his interpersonal issues, the power's coming back on. This reiterates that it was simply Thor's insecurities in his way, and since Loki is the only one who notices Thor is now making lightning again, it makes the payoff better when Loki looks proud after Thor blasts Hela. Loki's been waiting for Thor to realize he had it in him. Given Loki has spent most of the films being anxious of thunder, him now being proud only emphasizes his healthier relationship with Thor. It's why it's so important to get this reconciliation right, and not do this, dagnabbit. Now that they've reconciled, the brothers work much better as a team. They take out the guards in the hangar competently and have their choice of 2 spacecraft, the Commodore and a much larger, more military vessel I'm simply calling the Trooper. In the film, the Commodore was the only ship they needed because Thor used the gladiators for his own purpose, then deserted them. In our version, Thor plans on taking any rebels who want to leave Sakaar with him. So Thor insists on taking the Trooper for the extra space. There's just one problem. When they try to get the Trooper started, they find out that, as a military vessel, it requires security codes from both the Grandmaster and the head of security. Unless they can find their way around Topaz's passcode, they're stuck. Next, we go back to Valkyrie and the rebels as they clear out a few corridors of the palace. But this is where her company and Banner's part ways. She points out a corridor to Banner that will lead him out of the palace while she takes the rebels to hunt for the Grandmaster. Banner, Volstagg, and Fandral continue down the corridor but find their exit guarded. Fandral uses his injury in a scheme to get most of the guards to abandon their post, because I wanted him to be able to have something to contribute besides being carried around like a rag doll. And then Volstagg takes out the rest of the guards. Banner mostly feels inadequate in this scene because I want to show more of him feeling conflicted about standing on the sidelines before he finally decides to turn into the Hulk later. But then the trio head out into the city to search for the rendezvous point. Next, we see Topaz in a different hangar, not the Grandmaster's private one. She uses a communication station to order the guards to arms, to order any pilots to guard the wormholes and search for the fugitives, and to put a curfew in place for the people of Sakaar. Now, back to Thor and Loki. Loki is still trying but failing to figure out Topaz's passcode. The reason I put in this element is if we want Loki to show up to Asgard late, then we have to separate the brothers and have them leave Sakaar at different times. So, Thor looks out the gates of the hangar and notices the ships Topaz has sent on the manhunt. He realizes that Banner is going to have a hard time leading Volstagg and Fandral through the city safely. Thor tells Loki to keep working on the security code, but he's got to go clear a safe path to the rendezvous point for Banner. Before he leaves, he asks Loki if he'll see him at the rendezvous point, and Loki gives an ambiguous answer. Then, Thor is off on the Commodore, and the brothers are separated. Next, we cut to the Grandmaster as he enters the bunker room. I figure he's got a whole room with different bunkers that he can use depending on what mood strikes him whenever there's an attempted coup. But he opens the door to his bunker of choice only to find that the rebels got there first. They leap out of the bunkers in a surprise attack. While Valkyrie and the rebels fight, we return to Banner's crew as they bump into guards on the street. One of the guards has had duty in the arena before and recognizes Volstagg as having escaped. The way that I wrote this in my first draft, I split this scene into 2 parts, but I now think it's better to shorten this and get it all done in one go. So Volstagg is recognized and the guards raise their guns. We get a shot of Banner considering, but resisting, turning into the Hulk. Just as it looks like they're in real trouble with the guards, Thor arrives in the Commodore to save the day. We cut back to Valkyrie and the rebels as they win the battle. The Grandmaster, overconfident in his power over his sycophants, tells Valkyrie that she'll have to cut through his admirers if she wants to capture him. But the Grandmaster's hold over these people is frail, and his entourage simply steps out of Valkyrie's path. They have no real love of the Grandmaster to risk their lives for. The Grandmaster then dives into his bunker and locks himself inside. It's frustrating, but whether the Grandmaster wants to admit it or not, he has been defeated, and Valkyrie now has to keep to her promise to Thor. She tells the rebels that she won't coerce them, but any who want to help the Lord of Thunder should meet at the rendezvous point. She leaves so that they can decide for themselves what they want to do. We jump back to the Commodore just as Banner, Volstagg, and Fandral climb inside. They ask why Loki isn't there and assume that he must have betrayed Thor. Thor insists, "No, everything's fine. Loki would never." Then, as if to mock him, a giant hologram of Loki appears in the sky, which is why we set up that the Universal Remote can make these holograms. The Loki hologram declares that he's deposed the Grandmaster and is the new leader of Sakaar. Even though I said Loki's offer to help Thor should be genuine, that doesn't mean that we can't leave the audience wondering if Loki turned against his brother, like in the Dark World. It's fun, it shows Loki being crafty, and if Thor isn't sure if Loki betrayed him, it gives Thor a reason to leave without him so that we can get Loki's dramatic late arrival on Asgard. So, I guess I spoiled the plot. Loki isn't betraying Thor here, but let's have some fun with it anyway. While Thor wonders if he's been betrayed, he realizes the wormhole is heavily guarded. He turns the Commodore back to draw away the guards, and a spaceship chase ensues. We cut back to Topaz in that other hangar. She watches Loki's hologram through a window and recognizes her rival. As Loki gives a long-winded speech, he appears to make a mistake. The computer in the Trooper also gets put on blast throughout the city as it's recorded demanding Loki input the secondary security codes. There aren't many things that require the Grandmaster's security codes and Topaz's, so Topaz immediately knows where Loki is. She grabs a few guards and goes to capture him, but we learn Korg and some rebels are secretly following her. We cut back to the Commodore, and we do something similar to what Waititi's film did here, where Valkyrie comes to the rescue. Thor zips through the city and manages to lose all but one ship on his tail. Then another ship appears and blocks his way forward. But Valkyrie's been running across the rooftops on her way to the rendezvous point, and she leaps onto the ship in Thor's path. She hacks it up, and the Commodore dodges it. The ship tailing Thor crashes into the ship Valkyrie was on, and everyone worries Valkyrie has just died, until she lands on the roof of the Commodore and yells to be let in. Having defeated all the ships guarding the wormhole, they now go to the rendezvous point, just to find no one there. We cut back to the Grandmaster's private hangar as Topaz and the guards sneak aboard the Trooper. They find Loki in the cockpit, recording himself with the Universal Remote. He has his back turned to them and seems unaware they're there, so Topaz tries to grab him. Her hand goes right through what turns out to be a projection. The real Loki appears from the shadows and sticks his dagger to Topaz's throat. He locks the other guards outside the cockpit and convinces Topaz to enter in her security code. When it comes down to it, not even Topaz is loyal to the Grandmaster. The trooper starts, and Loki prepares himself to deal with the guards outside the door, but soon learns that Korg and the rebels have already handled them. And then we cut back to Thor at the rendezvous point. It appears as though our heroes have waited at the rendezvous point for a while, but no one else has come. Reluctantly, Thor agrees to leave, but just as the Commodore heads toward the wormhole, the trooper appears, unnoticed by Thor and company. Here is where we get to test Loki's bond with Thor. Loki watches the Commodore take off without him and feels used. But he also notices his dagger in this moment and at last remembers where he lost it. He realizes that Thor must have visited his memorial, and though we don't have it confirmed yet, this is where Loki decides to trust Thor and follow him to Asgard. At last, we've reached the battle for Asgard. For the most part, this last sequence of events is fine, but given changes we made earlier, there are some things that we need to make room for, like finding a healer for Fandral. I also want to make changes to Thor's last scene with his father, and I want to change the reason Heimdall leads the refugees to the observatory. In the film, the refugees are trying to flee Asgard, but again, this is a warrior culture. If Thor is stronger because of the people, then I want to see that they're stronger because of him. They're bolstered by his return, and they want to take back their home. If the refugees desperately fight to save Asgard, it also makes Thor's choice to sacrifice Asgard all the more of a sacrifice. So, our Heimdall leads them to recapture the Bifrost, a strategic location. But we begin the battle for Asgard with Hela and Scourge as they demand a crowd tell them where the Bifrost sword is. They threaten the crowd, but in our version, it's Hogun who says he knows where the sword is. We cut to the Commodore arriving at Asgard, and I want the destruction of Asgard to be far more obvious here. I shouldn't have to put on reading glasses to tell an evil goddess of death holed up here with an undead army. Show me a thick haze of smoke blotting out the sun. Show me ruin and scorched earth. This is a visual medium. Give me visuals, dagnabbit. Anyway, in the film, Valkyrie checks the ship's sensors and points out Hela is headed to the secret fortress. This might be nitpicky of me, but I always hated this because this implies Hela has a completely different heat signature from other Asgardians, that Thor and Valkyrie are aware of this, and that they've calibrated their sensors to detect it. It also kind of forgets that Asgard is supposed to be on fire and should probably be throwing off the sensors. So in our version, Valkyrie tells Thor that with the city on fire, they have no way of guessing where Hela is and they're going in blind. Thor still has to get Fandral to a healer though, so he tells her to drop them off near the palace. The next scene is perfectly fine. Heimdall's at the fortress and tells the refugees Hela is there, and we see Hela arrive outside the gates. Next, we cut back to the Commodore. Thor gives Valkyrie her old uniform. As Thor is leaving, Valkyrie calls him Your Majesty, and for the first time, she says it sincerely. This is one of a few moments the film hints at romantic tension between these two. Personally, if you're never going anywhere with that relationship, I think it's better not to set up those expectations in the first place. You don't want to upset an audience that now is hoping for these two to get together. Plus, we need more films where hot guys and hot girls can just platonically like each other, so we're making this platonic. We cut to the throne room then as Thor, Volstagg, and Fandral enter to find Hogun. Hogun gives Gungnir, the weapon of the king, to Thor. He says healers are waiting for Fandral, but in order to smuggle them into the healing rooms, they had to draw Hela away to the fortress. We cut back to the fortress, which Hela finds empty, because Heimdall is leading the refugees to take back the observatory while Hela was drawn away. We get that shot of Valkyrie in her old uniform, we get the shot of Thor on the throne with Gungnir, we see Hela looking back toward Asgard. Except in our version, she doesn't return to the palace because she's somehow heard Thor pounding Gungnir on the floor, like she's got Heimdall's hearing, but rather she notices the Commodore flying around and realizes that she has visitors. Next is Thor and Hela's confrontation. I made this meeting much more tragic and less sassy. As terrible as Hela is, she's also a victim of their father, and had things been different, she might have been saved. I gave Thor a line to call back to him telling Loki it's time to do better. Because while Loki and Hela seem very alike on the surface, this scene tells us what makes them different, and why Loki's redeemable while Hela isn't. Loki is different because, eventually, he's able to let go of the past, where she can't. And Loki's also different from Hela, ultimately, because he had Thor. No matter how strained Loki's relationship with Odin, he still had a semblance of love and brotherhood, even if Thor was an imperfect brother. This uplifts our theme of true strength coming from connection and community. It is deeply sad that Hela didn't have that. But Thor offers her, in a way, a small chance to let go of the past and embrace family. Hela's rejection of that chance is why she can't be saved, and the two siblings enter into battle. Next, the refugees get to the Bifrost. This was thoughtless in the film, because Heimdall's eyesight meant that they should never have been surprised by Hela's forces. They should have seen them long before they stepped foot on the bridge. But this still works in our version, because our refugees are looking to fight. So Scourge corners them, Fenris attacks, and Banner and Valkyrie show up to help. The next few shots we stick pretty close to Waititi's film. Hela wipes the floor with Thor, Scourge demands the Bifrost sword, Hela wipes the floor with Thor some more. Banner finally gives in and turns into the Hulk. The Commodore is swarmed, and Hela drags Thor to the balcony to taunt him and force him to watch. Next, Heimdall is attacked, Korg comes to the rescue, and
Your savior is here!
this is perfect as is, except Korg isn't here to help the refugees escape, but to help them fight. Again, we don't want anyone trying to flee until Thor makes the choice to sacrifice Asgard. We want that to be a really pronounced choice. Loki and Heimdall reunite, then we cut to Hela taunting Thor, which sends him into his vision of Odin. This is arguably the most important scene in the film, and Ragnarok got it wrong. Who is this guy? Because I can tell you, he's certainly not this guy who is ready to sacrifice his people in the Dark World.
And when he comes, his men will fall on 10,000 Asgardian blades.
And how many of our men shall fall on theirs?
As many as are needed!
It's inconsistent for Odin to be all Asgard, Schmasgard, it's the people who matter, when we haven't seen the character growth that would explain that. Second, in the Hollywood formula, there's usually a scene late in the film where our hero reconciles with the relationship character and learns the lesson that they're supposed to learn. Often, this is where the hero realizes that the relationship character was right all along, but in our case, Thor actually needs to realize Odin was wrong. But in Waititi's version, Thor still idealizes Odin and does not appear to have learned anything the film was trying to teach him. Odin has to hand Thor the answer because Thor can't figure it out for himself.
Without my hammer, I can't.
Are you Thor, the god of hammers? Asgard is not a place.
I'm not as strong as you.
No. You're stronger.
And I want better than this for our hero. For a film where Thor is supposed to learn he is worthy without Mjolnir, a weapon that represents his connection to his father and what his father considers worthy, Thor needs to realize that he needs to define worthiness for himself. It's okay for Thor to still love his father, but this is the moment he needs to finally confront Odin, take him off that pedestal, and figure out the truth on his own. He's been through a whole movie. He's earned that right to grow. So in our version, Odin delivers his line about Thor being the god of hammers mockingly, and we allow Thor to realize for himself that it's the people who strengthen him and who need protecting, not the palace or the city, not Odin's legacy. It is Thor who realizes he has to choose his own path now, get out from under his father's shadow, and be a stronger king than Odin was. And that, my friends, is what we call character growth. Then Thor calls his giant lightning bolt. Thor and Loki fight their way toward each other, just like in the film, with Thor's lightning now at full capacity. I changed some dialogue here. Thor tells Loki he wasn't sure he'd come, but that he'd hoped. Loki says he remembered where Thor must have found his dagger, and then jokes that he had to come to Asgard because Thor still owes him a throne. I brought this up because soon Thor tells his plan to let Ragnarok happen. Our Thor is someone who no longer bullies Loki into doing what he wants. He did promise Loki Asgard and a throne, and even though Thor knows what needs to be done, he's grown enough to at least check in with Loki first. This also allows Loki to have some small say in the decision, which shows us that he has grown enough to let go of the throne and embrace brotherhood. So Loki agrees to Thor's plan and heads for the palace vault. Thor tells Heimdall to get the refugees aboard the trooper. He and Valkyrie hold off Hela. Hela creates her spikes that trap the refugees. The undead scramble aboard the trooper, and it's time for Scourge's heroic moment. We didn't introduce Des and Troy in our version, so instead Scourge takes the Bifrost sword from Heimdall. I thought it was a nice touch to have Scourge start off the film as an unworthy keeper of the Bifrost sword and end the film as a more worthy keeper, even if it's only for a little while. In the film, Scourge redeems himself by dying for the refugees, and I thought about whether or not I wanted to keep this. The MCU too frequently depicts redemption through death. Heck, depending on how you want to define redemption through death, they do this with Loki alone 3 times. I'm not sure that's the best message, or even if it's an interesting message given how many times they've done it, but ultimately, given that this film's message is about unity and friendship, I didn't think it was appropriate for Scourge to die alone the moment he joins the right team. That, and I also needed a scene showing Fandral had been healed and was back, so instead of Scourge dying, the Warriors 3 show up to save him. Power of friendship to the rescue again. Then, the group of them hurry aboard the trooper just as it pulls safely away. From here, we follow Waititi's film right up until the scene inside the ship where the Asgardians watch their home get destroyed. We are not going to have Korg ruin the emotional impact of this moment with a joke.
Now those foundations are gone, sorry.
We're also not going to have Thor lament what he's done.
What have I done?
He can be sad for Asgard and for Hela, but he still knows he made the right choice. Now we start to wrap up the film with the scene of Loki visiting Thor. Instead of Thor telling Loki maybe there was some good in him after all, I have Thor tell Loki he's proud of him, so Loki can finally have a movie where he made a family member proud. Good boy. I know a lot of fans were a bit upset Thor said he'd give Loki a hug but didn't. I don't really see a reason not to let them, especially if Loki's going to be killed in the next film, so our brothers hug. And the rest of the film is fine. The brothers return to the cockpit, Thor sets a course for Earth, we get our mid-credits scene with Thanos' arrival, and we get our post-credit scene where the Grandmaster emerges from his bunker. Only in our scene, he emerges to find some of the rebels waiting for him, rather than the scrappers from Waititi's version. We cut to black, and that's it. That's the rewrite. Whew! If I ever do a rewrite again, it probably will not be this in-depth because this was intense. If you made it to the end, give yourself a pat on the back in the comments section. Hopefully you got something out of this. I did. I've done some work in theater and I've studied film as part of my major at university, but I've never actually written a stage or screenplay before. Any screenwriters in the audience can probably see where my background in novels reared its head. But this was still a fun experience, and I feel I got some good practice at improving dialogue. But with all the work I put into this rewrite, is this what I would have written if I'd been hired to write a movie about Thor and Loki facing off against Hela? Probably not, to be honest. I still feel like maybe the Grandmaster should have been the villain in his own separate comedic film. I thought it might have been neat if, instead of getting booted to Sakaar, Thor and Loki ended up on Vanaheim, where they met Sif and the Warriors 3, and decided to each go to different worlds in the 9 realms to gain allies against Hela. Thor and Loki would spend the bulk of the film going to Jotunheim, and I think the Jotnar would agree to help, but they've got some beef, particularly with Loki for what he attempted to do to them in the first Thor film. And they give the brothers a difficult task to accomplish for the Jotnar to prove their good intentions. Maybe there's a rogue giant on Jotunheim, giving the frost giants a real hard time, and the brothers have to deal with him, and this giant turns out to actually be the Hulk. But during their quest, Thor could really take the opportunity to see what a world conquered by his father looked like, where he could have looked at Jotunheim's history, not from the perspective of the conqueror, but of the conquered, and where he could have thought about how Loki's life might have been different, maybe even happier, if he'd grown up among his own people. And Loki could have done some hard work to start on reparations for his crimes. He could have learned to understand and appreciate his Jotnar heritage and let go of some of his self-loathing. Plus, I just really liked the idea of Loki being instrumental to securing a lasting peace with Jotunheim, fulfilling Odin's plans for Loki.
I thought we could unite our kingdoms one day, bring about an alliance, bring about a permanent peace through you. But those plans no longer matter.
But doing so in his own way and on his own terms. Doing so in a way Odin never would have planned or probably even appreciated. And since Thor and Loki wouldn't have had access to the Bifrost and would have had to take a spaceship to Jotunheim, it would leave the doors wide open for a whole series of comedic spin-off Thor and Loki road trip films, or maybe a Disney Plus series, where each episode was about some place the brothers had an adventure on their way to Jotunheim. Like, say, Sakaar. See? Now the Grandmaster gets his own comedic episode. I'm picturing some modern-day, cheesy Thor and Loki version of, like, Xena Warrior Princess, Hercules, or Sinbad the Sailor. Peak 90s television, done Marvel style. I would watch the heck out of that. Marvel, call me. Anyway, I think that's more than enough for this video. I hope it was helpful. Hope you had a good time. Hope I didn't step on too many toes. Let me know what you thought of the rewrite in the comments, but after this beast, I need a little R&R, so I will see you next time.